My name is Kent Heyward. Heritage Parkway stretched endlessly through nothing but scrubland and distant mountains that looked like broken teeth against the sky. I had driven this route once before for the interview, but forgot just how desolate it truly was. The asphalt disappeared into the heat shimmer ahead, and I wondered where exactly this highway was supposed to lead. I'd never driven to its end, and could not imagine what destination would justify its existence. In 23 miles, I passed exactly 4 vehicles traveling in the opposite direction, and none going my way. The McDonald's appeared like a mirage against the emptiness. I could not fathom the corporate logic behind placing a restaurant here, where no one lived and apparently no one traveled. The nearest town was 37 miles back the way I came. But I could not complain about the money. After Carson City, I learned quickly that employers did not want or need someone with a record. 3 years there taught me to accept what I could not control, and this job paid nearly quadruple what I should expect with my background. I'd gotten mixed up with the wrong crowd after college in New Mexico, and I had promised myself never to make those mistakes again. Taking orders from strangers was infinitely better than returning to a cell. As I finally pulled into the empty parking lot, I wondered who exactly would drive all this way for fast food. The building looked exactly like every other McDonald's except for the way it seemed to hunker against the vast nothingness surrounding it. Heat waves rose from the blacktop even though the desert evening was growing cool. I checked my watch and realized I was already late for my first shift. Whatever strange business model brought this restaurant to the middle of nowhere, I needed to make it work because my options were limited and my freedom depended on steady employment. The door chimes echoed through the empty restaurant as I stepped inside, and I immediately felt a blast of air conditioning. The fluorescent lights overhead colored everything in that familiar corporate yellow glow. Behind the counter, a figure moved methodically wiping down surfaces, never looking up when the door announced my arrival. I approached the counter, clearing my throat softly, and introduced myself as the new hire starting tonight. The woman finally raised her head, and I saw her tired, hollow eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. Her pale skin hugged tight over sharp cheekbones, and her long brown hair hung limp around her face. When she spoke, her voice carried no acknowledgement that we were two human beings meeting for the first time. "You are late. They do not like it when people are late here." I started to apologize, to explain about the drive and the unfamiliar route, but she had already bent down behind the counter and emerged with a uniform still wrapped in plastic. She placed down the counter between us. "You can change in the bathroom." The uniform felt heavy in my hands, and I noticed she had returned to her cleaning without another word. The restaurant stretched around us, filled with empty booths and silent equipment, and I realized this woman, whose name I did not even know, would likely be my supervisor. The oppressive use of the air conditioning was already reaching my bones, and I wondered what exactly I'd gotten myself into. But my parole officer had made it clear that steady employment was not optional. I clutched the uniform and tried to push down the growing unease that told me nothing about this place made sense. The bathroom was cramped and smelled of industrial disinfectant. I changed quickly into the uniform, which fit surprisingly well, though the fabric felt stiff and cheap against my skin. When I emerged, the woman was waiting behind the counter with the same expressionless face. She finally introduced herself as Sadie, though it felt like it took her a great deal of effort to do this. She gestured for me to follow her through the swinging doors into the kitchen area. The back of the restaurant felt even colder than the front, and everything gleamed under harsh fluorescent strips. I noticed several storage closets propped open with mops or plungers, while she moved between equipment, pointing to fryers and grills and warming trays, explaining their basic operation. I tried to absorb the information, but found myself distracted by how her movements appeared rehearsed, as if she had given this exact tour countless times before. When she finished showing me the fryer, I asked about the other employees and when I might meet them. "It will only be you and I for the 6 to 4 shifts," she said. I couldn't help but grimace slightly. 10 hours alone with this strange woman in the middle of nowhere seemed impossible. I had foolishly assumed that there would be a full crew even at this remote location. Before I could process this fully, another question escaped me. Why is the salary so high then? The words were out before I could stop them, and immediately I felt guilty, realizing that perhaps Sadie was not paid as much, and that I had just revealed my good fortune. But she showed no reaction to my discourtesy. It is because of the location. She offered nothing more. After giving up hope on any further elaboration, I finally asked about the manager, hoping to get an understanding of the chain of command. She set down her cloth and stared at me for what felt like minutes, though it was probably only a few seconds. Her face remained completely blank, but something in her eyes shifted slightly, as if she was deciding how much to tell me. Mr. Hendricks comes around sometimes. You'll know when he's here. I nodded and she handed me a mop, directing me to clean the dining area, while telling me she was going outside to change the filters. Before heading outside, Sadie turned back to me and delivered a final instruction. Never serve anyone who arrives on foot, she told me. If someone appears without a car, lock the doors immediately and wait in the kitchen. What do you mean by that? I asked. How could anyone possibly walk into this location in the middle of nowhere? She just stared at me for a moment. Do not look at them, she repeated. Do not speak to them under any circumstance. I wanted to ask more questions, but something in her demeanor warned me not to push further. She mentioned that if I ran out of tasks, I could do the required computer courses in the back office. Then she simply walked toward the rear exit without another word. I stood there, holding the mop, feeling completely bewildered by this bizarre warning. I tried to rationalize it, thinking maybe she meant hitchhikers or people whose cars had broken down. But her specific emphasis on not looking at them or speaking to them, to me that suggested something far more unusual. I mopped the already clean dining area for over half an hour. I was barely concentrating while I tried to process Sadie's bizarre instructions when I noticed a black sedan pull into the parking lot. I watched through the windows as a man in a dark suit emerged from the driver's seat. Even though the sun was already set, he wore dark sunglasses that reflected the fluorescent glow from inside the restaurant. His appearance was certainly formal for someone seeking fast food in the middle of nowhere. I had not even noticed that Sadie had returned from out back, but she was already behind the counter when the man pushed through the door. She greeted him with the same flat monotone she used for everything and asked for his order. The man stood motionless for what felt like an entire minute before finally requesting a single hamburger. After Sadie acknowledged his order, the man turned his body completely toward me with an abrupt mechanical movement. Behind the dark lenses, I could feel his attention fixed directly on my face, though I could not see his eyes. He asked where the bathroom was located. I found myself frozen with the mop still in my hands, unable to respond immediately. The man continued staring at me without moving until I finally raised my arm and pointed towards the corner where the bathroom door stood. I watched as the man walked through the dining area. When he reached the bathroom door, he extended his hand towards the handle with a hesitant uncertainty, as if he was studying some foreign apparatus. His fingers probed at the metal surface awkwardly before eventually wrapping around it with unnatural grip. He twisted his entire wrist clockwise and then counterclockwise while pulling the door toward him rather than pushing. When this failed, he released his grip entirely and tried again, this time wrapping his fingers around the handle backwards with his knuckles facing the door. He began turning it repeatedly, but the door remained closed. For nearly 30 seconds he continued this fumbling motion, twisting the handle again and again, like someone who had never opened a door. At one point, it appeared as if he was pressing the back of his hand downward against the handle. Finally, I called out asking if the door was locked. The man stopped his movements entirely and turned his body toward me again, before answering, "Yes." I set down the mop and walked behind the counter searching for keys. When I found a ring of keys, I approached the bathroom door and tested the handle myself, only to discover that it turned easily, with the door swinging open without resistance. The man thanked me and stepped inside, letting the door close behind him. I stood there staring at the door, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. Sadie appeared beside me and showed no reaction. "We need to rotate the stock in the back." Relief washed through me at the prospect of retreating from the dining area. I followed her through the swinging doors into the kitchen and then further back towards the storage area. Sadie moved between the shelves, pulling boxes forward and checking dates printed on the sides. "The older stock always goes to the front. Check the dates on everything," she said. She demonstrated by lifting a case of hamburger buns and pointing to the small numbers stamped on the packaging. "If something expires in 2 days, it goes to the front. If something expires in more than 5 days, to the back." I nodded and began moving boxes according to her instructions. The methodical work of checking dates and rearranging inventory provided a welcome distraction from the growing unease that seemed to permeate every corner of this place. The quiet concentration required for this task felt infinitely preferable to standing behind the counter waiting for more customers. Each box I moved and each day I verified created a small sense of accomplishment that had been absent from my life since before Carson City. I dragged it out as long as I could, double-checking each date as I went. I felt that perhaps if I could convince Sadie to assign me more tasks like this, that I might actually survive this job after all. After an hour of inventory work, I returned to the front of the restaurant. The dining area was still empty when I got there, but I heard a persistent rhythmic thumping coming from somewhere near the corner of the room. The sound carried a desperate quality that I could not immediately place. I stood behind the counter listening silently. The thumping was definitely coming from the bathroom door. I waited for several minutes, hoping the sounds would stop, or that someone would simply emerge on their own, but the sounds continued without pause. My time incarcerated had taught me to avoid unnecessary confrontation and to mind my own business as much as possible. Yet, something about the desperation in those sounds made it impossible to ignore. I approached the door slowly and called out, asking if they needed help. The thumping stopped immediately, creating a void of any sound at all. I waited for a response until I began to wonder if I'd imagined the entire thing. I tested the door handle and found it still unlocked. The door swung inward easily and I stepped back instinctively as the fluorescent lights from the dining area spilled into the small bathroom space. The man in the dark suit stood facing me, a mere foot from the door. Both of his hands were covered in blood. His fingers were no longer fingers at all, but ragged stumps of bone and torn flesh had left streaks of bright red blood across the door its interior handle. The tips of all 10 digits appeared to have been worn away completely, as if he had been clawing at the wooden surface with such force that the bone itself had been ground down to nothing. Blood dripped steadily from his mangled hands onto the white flooring, creating small pools. But his expression showed no pain or distress whatsoever. Behind his dark sunglasses, he remained completely calm, as if he had simply been washing his hands. He looked down at his destroyed fingers with the same detached interest someone might show when examining a minor paper cut. The stumps continued bleeding freely, but he made no effort to tend to them or even acknowledge their condition. "Thank you," was all he said as he stepped past me through the door. I watched him walk across the dining area, dripping blood onto the floor until the door chimes announced his departure. Through the windows, I watched him all the way back to his black sedan, where he somehow managed to open the driver door despite his mutilated hands. The engine started immediately, and he drove away into the desert darkness. I couldn't explain why, but it seemed easier to clean up the mess than to try to explain it to Sadie. Perhaps I'd felt that cleaning it would make it feel like it never happened, or maybe because telling her would give credence to what I'd just witnessed, but I fetched the mop and bleach anyway. The blood came up easily from the tiles, and within minutes no evidence remained of what had occurred. I disposed of the bloody paper towels in the kitchen bin and returned the cleaning supplies to their proper places. When Sadie emerged from the back storage area, I was already behind the counter, arranging napkin dispensers as if nothing had happened at all. "You should start your computer work in the back," she said. I nodded. The thought of sitting alone with the computer felt far more desirable than standing behind the counter waiting for more customers to arrive. I walked through the kitchen past the storage closets that remained propped open with their mops. The back office was cramped and windowless, with a single desk supporting an outdated computer that hummed loudly. It was the only room that seemed immune to the Arctic-style air conditioning. A stack of papers sat beside the keyboard, along with a binder labeled New Employee Orientation in faded corporate lettering. I settled into the chair and powered on the monitor, which displayed the familiar McDonald's logo before prompting me to enter my employee identification number. The first module was titled Food Safety and Sanitation. It began with a cheerful narrator explaining proper hand-washing techniques. I clicked through slides about temperature controls and cleaning protocols while trying to focus on the mundane information. The second module covered customer service basics with role-playing scenarios about handling difficult customers. I found myself wondering if there was a specific protocol for serving people who arrived without vehicles or customers who mutilated themselves in the bathroom. The computer voice droned on about maintaining a positive attitude and exceeding customer expectations, while I struggled to concentrate on anything except the growing certainty that nothing about this place made sense. I kept trying to remind myself that my other options remained severely limited. Even if I managed to find another employer willing to hire someone with my record, it would probably pay peanuts compared to what I earned here. I must have lost track of time because it was 1:49 a.m. when Sadie came into the office. She stared at me for a moment longer than seemed necessary before speaking. "Get up." I looked at her confused and asked what she meant, but she had already turned around from the desk. She walked to the light switch on the wall and flipped it off, plunging the small office into darkness. On Mondays, at 1:51 each week, we need to turn off all the lights and sit in the closet. I tried to ask why, but Sadie had already left the office, and I could hear her moving through the kitchen, turning off more lights. The fluorescent strips went dark one by one until only the emergency exit signs remained glowing. I sat there in the chair, feeling completely bewildered by this bizarre protocol. Through the open office door, I could still see Sadie's silhouette moving through the restaurant, extinguishing every source of light. I eventually stood up and followed her voice through the darkened kitchen. She was already at one of the storage closets that had been propped open. I could make out 2 chairs positioned inside the cramped space. Sadie gestured for me to sit down in one of the chairs. I hesitated because the entire situation felt absurd. I wanted to demand an explanation, but something about the moment felt life or death. I finally lowered myself into the uncomfortable plastic chair and watched as Sadie settled into the seat beside me. She reached up and pulled the light cord, plunging us into complete darkness. The closet was so dark that I could not even make out Sadie sitting within an arm's reach until my eyes began to slowly adjust. Even then, she remained little more than a faint outline against the deeper blackness. I asked again why we had to do this, but she simply did not respond. We sat motionless and freezing, as if this ritual was as normal as stocking the shelves. The silence in the closet pressed against my eardrums like deep water. The darkness felt complete and suffocating, and I began to think that she had not simply turned off the lights, but somehow killed the power to the entire building. Even the constant hum of the refrigeration units had gone silent. After several minutes of this silence, I heard something outside. At first, it sounded like a customer attempting to open the door. The sound grew more distinct and rhythmic. Something was testing the front doors. I could hear the metal handles rattling as whatever was outside pulled and pushed against them with increasing persistence. Each attempt grew more violent until it seemed like the entire door frame would be ripped from the building. I turned towards Sadie in the darkness, fighting the urge to grab her arm. Even in the blackness, I could sense that she remained completely motionless. Her breathing never changed, and she showed no reaction whatsoever to the sounds that were making my heart pound against my ribs. I pressed my back against the closet wall and tried to control my breathing, while whatever was outside grew more frantic in its attempts to enter. It was in that moment, sitting in complete darkness, listening to something trying to break into the restaurant, that I had made my decision. I would not return to this job tomorrow. I would not return ever. Whatever consequences my parole officer threatened could not be worse than whatever was happening at this place. Prison was a known quantity. This was something else entirely. The scraping and rattling gradually diminished until the silence returned. I waited for what felt like an eternity before Sadie finally stirred beside me. She stood up without a word, and I heard her fumble for the light cord. The single light bulb illuminated the cramped closet. I had to squint against the sudden brightness. Sadie showed no trace of fear or concern as she stepped past me toward the door. I followed her out of the closet and watched as she moved through the restaurant, systematically turning lights back on. Everything appeared exactly as we had left it. The doors remained intact and locked. The windows showed no signs of damage. Whatever had been outside left no evidence of its presence. I stood in the kitchen watching Sadie restore the restaurant to its normal state. I didn't bother asking what had happened, or what had been outside. The questions felt pointless now that I had decided to leave. I didn't even want to know. I had already decided that the next day I would call my parole officer and explain that the job was not suitable. I would accept whatever consequences came rather than spend another night in this place. The rest of the shift passed in relative quiet. Sadie assigned me more inventory tasks, and I completed them mechanically while counting down the hours until 4 a.m. When 4 o'clock finally arrived, I helped Sadie complete the closing procedures. We turned off equipment and locked the registers and wiped down surfaces one final time. The routine felt surreal after everything that had happened, but I followed her instructions without comment. My mind was already focused on the conversation I would have with my parole officer the next morning. As we prepared to leave, Sadie gathered her things and headed toward the back exit. As we stepped outside, she turned to me with the same expressionless face she wore for the entire night. "I will see you tomorrow." I nodded automatically, though I knew I would not be returning. The lie felt easier than explaining my decision to someone who clearly existed in a different reality. I woke at noon with my phone already in my hand. The number for my parole officer felt burned into my memory from the countless times I had dialed it over the past months. I had rehearsed the conversation during the sleepless hours after returning from that first shift. I would be direct and firm. I would explain that the job presented safety concerns and that I intended to seek more suitable employment immediately. But when Officer Martinez answered on the third ring, my prepared speech crumbled before it could ever truly begin. "Kent, you better not be calling to tell me you're quitting that job." The directness in his voice caught me completely off guard. I fumbled for my rehearsed explanation about safety concerns and unsuitable working conditions, but he cut me off before I could form a complete sentence. "Listen to me very carefully. You've been out for exactly 4 months. The terms of your parole require steady employment, and you know damn well how hard it was to find someone willing to hire you with your record. If you quit this job after one shift, it goes in your file as job abandonment. That violates the employment stability requirement and puts you right back in front of the judge." I tried to interrupt, but he continued without pause. You think finding another job is going to be easier with job abandonment on your record? You think any employer wants to hire someone who walks away after one day? This McDonald's is paying you more than you deserve, and more than you'll find anywhere else. You will stick with it. The fear that gripped me during that phone call was different from what I had experienced at the restaurant the night before. I tried to summon that fear and anxiety I'd felt in the closet. It had fueled me to pick up the phone in the first place, but it had already been replaced by something else. Prison was concrete and immediate. Prison was walls and bars and the constant weight of confinement pressing against your chest. The strange incident at the McDonald's felt surreal and impossible, but prison was undeniably real. I reluctantly agreed to continue the job while quietly searching for alternatives. The compromise felt like defeat even as I spoke the words, but surely I could endure a few more shifts while discreetly applying elsewhere. As I drove the same desolate stretch of Heritage Parkway toward my second shift, I'd wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. The desert stretched endlessly on both sides of the road, just as it had the day before, but somehow the landscape felt more oppressive in the harsh afternoon sun. I arrived 15 minutes early and found the dining area completely empty. The air conditioning was still blasting cold enough to make my breath visible. I walked through the swinging doors into the kitchen where I found Sadie. "Good evening." She looked up from her cleaning and nodded once before returning to her task. I stood there for a moment watching her work, trying to gather the courage to ask the questions that had been eating at me all day. "How long have you been working here?" 2 years. She moved to the fire and began scrubbing at the grease stains that appeared already clean. I waited for her to elaborate, but she offered nothing more. "When do you think the manager will be by? I was hoping to talk to him." Sadie didn't bother looking up. "He stopped by last night." I sighed silently. I had been in the restaurant for nearly 10 hours the previous night, and I had not seen the manager. I would have remembered another person entering during all the strange incidents that had occurred. "I didn't see him," I countered. "He probably will not be back tonight," was all she offered. I tried to think back through every moment of the previous shift, searching my memory for any sign of another person. "When exactly did he come by? I was here the whole time." Sadie had already turned back to her cleaning, as if the conversation was over, and I took her cue warily. The first few hours passed with something resembling normalcy. 3 separate customers arrived within the span of an hour, which felt sort of like a miracle compared to the previous night's isolation. They arrived in vehicles, they spoke coherently, and they paid for their orders and departed without incident. I found myself hoping that perhaps the first night had been an anomaly, and that the job might actually prove manageable after all. After another customerless hour that I'd spent cleaning an already spotless dining room, I saw a car pulling into the parking lot. The vehicle moved slowly, and as it drew closer to the building, I could see that the front end was severely damaged. The hood crumpled inward and deep dents ran along the passenger side. One of the rear windows was completely missing. A woman emerged from the driver's seat. Her right arm hung limp and her left arm at an impossible angle, bent nearly backwards at the elbow in a way that should have made movement excruciating. Dark bruises covered the visible portions of her face and neck. She was missing her right shoe and walked with a pronounced limp, yet her movements showed no indication of pain or distress. She approached the entrance with the same casual gait as someone might use while strolling through the park. I stood behind the counter, watching her push through the door, and immediately felt compelled to help. The extent of her injuries demanded immediate medical attention. I could not understand how she was even conscious, let alone driving. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need me to call 911? She looked at me with eyes that seemed to focus somewhere beyond my face, and completely ignored my question. "I would like a large coffee with milk, please." Her demeanor showed no signs of pain or urgency despite the obvious severity of her appearance. I stared at her mangled arm and the bruises that covered her features, trying to process how someone in her state could be concerned with ordering coffee. "Ma'am, I really think you need medical attention. I can call an ambulance for you." Again, she showed no acknowledgement of my concern, or her own condition. "Just the coffee, please." Before I could respond further, I heard Sadie's voice from directly behind me, though I had not heard her approach. "One large coffee with cream. That will be $2.37. I turned to find Sadie already moving towards the coffee machine, with the same efficiency she applied to everything else. She had no reaction to the customer's obvious injuries as she filled the cup and added the milk. I watched as the woman shoved her clearly broken arm into one of her pockets and paid with the exact change. She accepted her coffee before walking back the way she came. "What the hell was that?" I said. Sadie was already wiping down the counter where the woman had placed her money. "It is best to just serve the customers as they are," she said. The casual way she delivered this statement finally broke my mounting frustration. "This is insane. Nothing about this place makes any sense. What is going on here?" For the first time since I had met Sadie, she seemed to break character. She paused her cleaning and looked directly at me. "It has been strange lately. It is not always like this." She rendered nothing more and returned to her wiping. But the admission felt significant. At least she acknowledged that the incidents were unusual, even by whatever standards applied to this place. I retreated to the back office, feeling more confused than ever. I settled into the cramped chair and tried to focus on finishing the computer modules I'd started the night before. The cheerful corporate narrator droning on and on about proper food handling procedures did nothing to quell my nerves. I clicked through several more slides when I noticed something at the bottom of the screen. A small taskbar showed another window minimized beneath the training program. Without really thinking, I clicked on it, and an Excel spreadsheet opened across the monitor. The document was labeled Quality Assurance in bold letters across the top. Below that stretched a list with dates and times running down the left column. Next to each entry was a simple checkbox marked either pass or fail. The dates went back several months, with most entries showing pass, but scattered fail marks appeared throughout. I scrolled down trying to make sense of the information, but the entries provided no context about what was being evaluated. The times seemed random, with some occurring during our shift hours. I noticed that several recent dates showed fail, including one from just 3 nights ago. I tried to return my attention to the modules, but found myself constantly minimizing it to stare at that strange spreadsheet. The dates and times meant nothing to me, yet something about them felt deeply important. I scrolled through entry after entry looking for patterns or explanations that never materialized. I forced myself to close the document and return to finish my work, but my concentration was completely shattered. When I finally completed the mandatory coursework, I decided to find Sadie and attempt to ask her about it subtly. I walked through the kitchen towards the back meeting room where I'd seen her disappear earlier. The door stood slightly ajar, and I could hear her voice coming from inside. As I approached, I realized she was on the phone. "Yes, I understand," she was saying. "Tomorrow, then." I paused outside the door, not wanting to interrupt her conversation, though through the gap I could see her standing with her back to me. The phone was pressed against her ear. "I will make sure everything is ready," she continued. The call ended abruptly and I heard her set the phone down on the table. I knocked gently on the doorframe and stepped into the room. Sadie turned toward me, and for the first time she looked genuinely concerned. Her usual expressionless demeanor had been replaced by something that resembled actual worry. "Corporate might be coming by for an inspection tomorrow," she said without preamble. "We need to thoroughly clean everything tonight. All the equipment needs to be checked and rechecked, Everything must be up to standard. She moved past me towards the kitchen with an urgency I'd never seen from her before. I followed her out of the meeting room, my questions about the document suddenly feeling insignificant compared to the genuine anxiety radiating from this woman. I had been scrubbing the fryer for the past hour when the door chimes announced another customer. I looked out from my cleaning to see a man standing just inside the entrance. He stood motionless except for his head turning slowly left and right, as if surveying unfamiliar territory. He wore a gray jacket and dark trousers and stood perfectly upright with his arms hanging straight at his sides. After several seconds, he took 2 hesitant steps forward before stopping completely. Between him and the ordering counter stood the small waist-high partition that guided customers into the proper queue. He stared at it as if it presented an insurmountable obstacle. "Can I help you, sir?" The man stopped and directed his attention to me. "Can you come outside with me?" The sentence alone alerted my flight or fight mechanism. I glanced towards the windows behind him and silently cursed myself when I saw only Sadie and I's vehicle sitting there. I spun around and practically ran towards the back of the restaurant. I struggled to breathe as I searched for Sadie through the kitchen area. I found her near the storage room. "Sadie," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "There's a customer out front who arrived on foot." Her head snapped up immediately. She stared at me for several seconds as if processing the implications of what I had just told her. Her usual expressionless mask had been replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Without saying a word, she moved past me towards the light switches. One by one, the fluorescent strips went dark. The familiar ritual from my first night was beginning again. "Come on," she whispered, leading me into the same storage closet where we had hidden before. I followed her into the cramped space and sat onto one of the plastic chairs as she pulled the door closed behind us. The darkness felt even more suffocating than it had the first time. "It will be okay," she said quietly into the blackness. We sat motionless in the cramped darkness, listening to the sounds of someone fumbling around the restaurant. The man's voice drifted through the walls as he moved through the kitchen area, calling out the same phrase over and over. "Can you come outside with me?" The voice grew closer to our hiding spot, and I pressed myself deeper into the plastic chair. In that moment, I wished I was back in prison. Beside me, Sadie remained perfectly still. Several minutes passed as the sounds continued moving through the back rooms. Then I heard a door close with a solid thunk, followed by silence. We sat there, listening to the same sounds now repeat from the exact same location. Sadie suddenly stood up in the darkness and reached for the light cord. The single bulb illuminated our cramped space, much to my own alarm. "What are you doing?" My voice came out as a harsh whisper. The sounds were still occurring just outside our hiding place. I could not understand why she would risk exposing us now. But Sadie was already opening the closet door and stepping into the kitchen. The fluorescent strips flicked on one by one as she moved through the restaurant, restoring power. I remained frozen in the chair, unable to comprehend why she was abandoning our safety. "Come on," she called back to me. I reluctantly emerged from the closet and followed her through the kitchen. Sadie led me towards the sound, and I saw the source immediately. One of the storage closets that had been propped open with a mop now stood closed. I watched as something from inside the door seemed to press against it without opening it. "We can be done early tonight." Sadie delivered this statement with a matter-of-fact tone as she walked past the closet door toward the front of the restaurant as if nothing unusual had occurred. I stood there staring at the closet door. The sight felt surreal in a way that I could not fully process. The terror I had felt in the closet still had some sort of hold on me, because I found myself following Sadie toward the exit. The promise of leaving early felt like a gift I could not refuse, even though nothing about this made sense. I promised myself that the next day I would call my parole officer and explain that I was quitting regardless of consequences. I would not accept a refusal this time. Sadie held the front door open and told me that she would close the restaurant. I stared at the ground as I exited. I heard her say, "See you tomorrow," as I got into my car. I spent the entire morning pacing around my apartment, wrestling with the same impossible decision. Every time I reached for my phone to call Officer Martinez and quit, I saw myself back in my concrete cell. Every time I imagined walking through those McDonald's doors again, my hands started shaking. The walls of my studio apartment felt like they were closing in as they rehearsed different versions of a conversation. I could tell Martinez about the strange events, but he would think I was making excuses or having some kind of breakdown. At 2 p.m., I finally made the call. Before I could even get into anything that I had rehearsed, Martinez took over. "Look, Kent, I've pulled some strings. I might have something for you, a real opportunity. But it's going to take a week, maybe 10 days to finalize the paperwork and the background checks. You have to hold on to this job until then. If you quit now, the other door slams shut, and you're back to square one, with a violation on your record." A mixture of relief and anxiety flooded through me at the same time. Theoretically, a week was a spectacular time frame to expect for something like this, but the thought of even one more shift at the restaurant made me almost puke. I tried pleading with Martinez to accelerate the timeline, explaining again that the job presented genuine safety concerns. His response remained inflexible. The paperwork required specific processing periods that couldn't be rushed, and any deviation from my current employment would immediately trigger a parole violation. After hanging up, I sat on my bed staring at the wall and forced myself to confront the brutal mathematics of survival. 1 week meant approximately 4 more shifts at the restaurant. I repeated a simple mantra to myself until it became my entire strategy. Survive and don't get fired. Nothing else mattered except making it through each shift without being terminated or walking away voluntarily. I didn't need to understand what was happening or why. I just needed to endure. I arrived at the restaurant for my 3rd shift and found Sadie sitting in one of the corner booths with paperwork spread across the table in front of her. She looked up at my arrival and waved a quick hand. "Corporate will be visiting today," she said without introduction. "I do not know what time they will arrive." I approached her booth, trying subtly to get a look at the papers she had on the table. "What will we be doing when they get here?" She began shuffling her papers, seeming to look for something, and responded without looking at me. "I'm not sure, but you will need to handle the customers when they are here." I nodded and headed toward the back to begin my shift, while trying to push down the growing uncertainty that the day would bring fresh complications to an already impossible situation. I began cleaning the kitchen despite having done it thoroughly yesterday, and finding it appeared almost unused since. The fryers gleamed under the lights and the stainless steel surfaces reflected my movements as I wiped them down again. Every task felt mechanical and pointless, but I attacked each one with deliberate focus, trying to keep my mind occupied. As I scrubbed at grease stains that didn't exist, I found myself playing with an idea that had been festering in my mind. Maybe I could bring up the strange events to corporate when they arrived. Maybe they would put a stop to whatever was happening here, if they knew about it. The thought felt very dangerous, but also potentially liberating. Perhaps they were unaware of what was occurring during the night shifts and would intervene once informed. But even as I considered this possibility, I knew it aligned poorly with my primary goal of simply surviving until Martinez could arrange my transfer. Drawing attention to myself or making waves could easily backfire and result in immediate termination. My record meant I had no leverage and no credibility if corporate chose to dismiss my concerns as ramblings of an ex-convict. I decided I would assess the situation when corporate arrived and make my choice then. The thought of having witness to whatever strangeness occurred here felt like I might provide some protection or at least validation that I wasn't losing my mind. When I finished cleaning, I began putting the supplies away. Each mop found its designated hook, and every bottle of cleaner returned to its proper shelf. As I worked my way through the storage area, I came to the closet where yesterday's incident had occurred. I stared at the door for several moments before testing the handle from the outside. It turned easily and the door swung open to reveal more cleaning supplies and empty shelves. I found myself stepping into the cramped space to test the handle from within. I pulled the door closed behind me and immediately felt the familiar claustrophobia of confinement. The handle turned smoothly in both directions without any resistance whatsoever. I pushed the door open to find Sadie standing directly in front of me. "Corporate is about to walk in," she said flatly. "You need to man the front of the house." I glanced past her shoulder and saw two men in dark suits walking down the hallway toward the back meeting room. They moved with corporate authority like they owned whatever space they occupied. The men disappeared through the meeting room doorway without acknowledging my presence. Sadie immediately followed them down the corridor, leaving me standing alone beside the storage closet. I finished putting away the cleaning supplies and made my way back towards the front of the restaurant. As I walked past the meeting room, I realized I could hear voices from inside. I paused outside the doorway. The conversation was muffled, but I could make out fragments if I stood close enough to the gap. Sadie's voice carried a tone of frustration that I'd never heard from her before. "The quality has been difficult to deal with and keep employees," she was saying. One of the corporate men responded in a deeper voice that I could barely distinguish. "The cleanup crew has had a difficult time catching and returning the failures," he said. I pressed closer to the door, trying to make sense of what they were discussing. Another voice, probably the second corporate man, added something about containment protocols and maintaining the test schedule. I found myself holding my breath as I strained to hear more. The conversation continued but became increasingly difficult to follow. I caught fragments about specimen quality and disposal procedures. I finally got spooked when I heard one of the men move their chairs. I quickly moved from the door, taking a long way around the back to the front end. I returned to the counter where I found a customer waiting in line. My pulse quickened when I reflexively glanced through the windows and counted only 2 vehicles in the parking lot. I realized I had no idea if the corporate men had arrived together. I silently stared at the vehicles, hoping some sort of answer would come to me. Eventually, without even looking at the man in mine, I made a silent prayer that they had arrived together in the same vehicle. "Can I take your order?" When I finally looked at the man, recognition hit me like a freight train. The same dark suit, the same rigid posture. It was the man from my first night who had destroyed his hands in the bathroom. I looked down to his hands where I saw perfect fingers, unmarked skin, and no trace of the bone stumps I'd witnessed just days before. The man stared at me in complete silence. His proximity made retreat feel impossible at this time. I stood frozen behind the counter, feeling utterly trapped. "You always die," he delivered flatly. My mouth went dry. "What?" "The person in your position. They always die. I've seen it before." I looked at him again. "I don't understand what you're talking about," I responded. I glanced towards the back hallway where the corporate meeting continued behind the closed door. "I can help you," he said. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could hear it. "How?" He seemed to measure me before he responded. "If you open the door to the meeting room in the back, you can drive away. You can leave and never return." The offer hung in the air between us. I stared at his reconstructed hands, trying to process what he was suggesting. "They won't be able to follow you if you do this one thing," he said. I looked towards the back hallway again and then back to his face. It didn't feel like I had any decision to make. I found myself standing behind the counter, staring into that familiar expressionless face, while my entire body seemed to vibrate with terror. The man waited patiently, as if he had all the time in the world for me to make my decision. Without speaking, I stepped around the counter and began walking towards the back of the restaurant. The man fell into step behind me, and I felt the weight of his presence like a knife pressing between my shoulder blades. Each footstep felt like it could be my last. I paused outside the doorway, feeling my hands shake almost uncontrollably. The conversation inside had grown more animated. It took me almost a full minute and the realization that there was no going back for me to finally reach for the door handle. The handle turned easily under my grip, and the door swung inward, revealing Sadie and both corporate men seated around the small table, covered with papers and documents. All three looked up simultaneously as the door opened, and their expressions shifted immediately to annoyance. They could only see me standing in the doorway. "What is it?" one of the men asked angrily. I turned to look at the man behind me one final time, searching his face for some sign of humanity. He simply nodded once before stepping past me through the doorway into the meeting room. The moment he crossed the threshold, all three people inside shot to their feet. Sadie backed against the far wall while both corporate men stumbled backwards over their chairs. One of them began shouting something I could not understand, while the other fell to the floor over his chair. The man in the dark suit stood perfectly still in the center of the room, staring at them with the same expressionless calm he had shown me. I made my decision in that instant and pulled the door closed behind him. The solid click of the latch felt like the most important sound I had ever heard. Immediately, the shouting from inside grew louder and more frantic. I heard chairs being overturned and papers scattering across the floor. I walked quickly through the kitchen towards the front of the restaurant as the voices behind me in the meeting room transformed from angry shouting into something that sounded unmistakably like screaming. I did not run, but I moved with purpose towards the exit, while the sounds grew more desperate and inhuman. I listened to the door chimes for the final time as I stepped into the desert night air. I climbed into my car and started the engine. I took one last look at the front of the restaurant before pulling away. I never returned to that McDonald's. I drove straight home that night through the desert darkness and never looked back. The strangest part was that nobody ever contacted me about my absence. No phone calls from management, no inquiries from corporate, no demands for an explanation or return of my uniform. Officer Martinez never called either. 3 days passed in complete silence before I worked up the courage to contact his office. The receptionist informed me that Martinez had transferred to another district and that my case had been reassigned. The new parole officer, Mrs. Williams, reviewed my file during our first meeting and seemed genuinely concerned about my employment situation. She helped me secure a position at a Walmart distribution center on the outskirts of Reno within 2 weeks. The pay was less than half of what I had been earning at McDonald's, but the work felt merciful. I stocked shelves and caused no problems. I moved to Reno shortly after starting the job. The city felt large enough to disappear into while still maintaining the kind of steady employment that filled my parole requirements. I found a small apartment above a laundromat. The work at Walmart provided structure and routine that almost began to feel like safety. About once a week, I see him watching me from a distance. He stands perfectly still at parking lots or across busy streets, close enough for me to see the stumps where his hand should be.